everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and we are back at the Midtown Scholar sort room where we are just overwhelmed with books. Came back this morning from the Lancaster Mennonite Bookworm Frolic with 900 religious books, all of which we're going to be processing here in the sort room in the next few days. But today I wanted to take you through a few more of the treasures that we found on our recent book picking trip to upstate New York. And today's theme is books which aren't really what they seem to be. So, on that note, we're going to start with this book, which, frankly, really isn't a book at all, but sure looks like a book, because this is an 18th century book safe. And inside the book safe, you see that there's a hollowed out cavern where you could hide all sorts of things. I hid this little book, which we'll get to in just a moment. You've got the marbleized paper, you've got the old pages of the book glued down, and then when you shut the book, you can barely tell. Now, in the 18th century and even the 19th century, book safes were very, very popular. You could hide valuables, jewelry, even weapons I've seen in book safes. One hint on determining whether or not a book is a book safe without opening it, sometimes the little clues and the labels on the book safe. So this book, for instance, it's in French, but this book is on the wealth of nations. So volume 3 of the Wealth of Nations, but in that sense, it probably was used to hide money. There was probably a big stash of francs in it at one point 100 years ago. Now, this little book, which I put in there, is very valuable, and that's why I hid it in the book safe. And this book is special because we found it on our trip on a bargain bin cart. And bargain carts are all the rage. If you've been to the Midtown Scholar, you know we have dozens of bargain carts outside the bookstore, and now we're offering books by the bag load. Well, I was reading the New York Times book review this week, and what was on the back of the New York Times book review? Well, it was the Strand's bargain carts. And that's all they need to do for the Strands is just show a bargain cart. People love bargain carts. By the way, our bargain carts are a better deal than the Strands bargain carts. Well, this little book was on the bargain cart. It probably shouldn't have been on the bargain cart, but it was. And one of the reasons it was on the bargain cart is because A, it's in Hebrew, and B, there's no title page. And frankly, I think the bookseller had no idea what to do with it. Now, Amanda, would you care to guess, just looking at the book, and I know I'm not giving you much, how old do you think the book is? Just take a wild guess.
Late 18th century.
Okay, late 18th century. Well, you're off by only a couple hundred years because this book actually dates to 1544. It's the oldest book I've ever found on a bargain cart. And the paper looks like it's pretty much done yesterday. And even though there's no title page, there is what is called a printer's device. And if you look on the last page, which is really the first page, because of course the book reads backwards because it's in Hebrew, you see this printer's device, sometimes called a printer's mark. And it's a gentleman who's really St. Paul underneath an olive tree with a Latin motto about being humble. And I recognize that printer's device immediately as being the device used by the printers to the King of France back in the 16th century, the Estaing family. It's quite a famous device, but that dated it to 1544. And when I looked further, I discovered that this was, in fact, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, pocket Hebrew edition of the first books of the Bible. Pocket edition because you could literally stick it in your pocket. And it was originally published in 17 volumes. And if you had all 17 volumes, it would be worth tens of thousands of dollars. This is just the book of Genesis. Just the book of Genesis, but it is famous because of the size, but also because Estaing and his family were amazing printers, and they developed the fonts and the typefaces, and this is considered a masterwork of early Hebrew printing, and it was on a bargain cart. I'm not making that up. All right, one final book for today, and this one is a doozy. We also found this one in upstate New York. It is a wonderful book, and let's just go straight to the title. It is A Description of Formosa by a gentleman named George Psalmanazar. Now, George Psalmanazar was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person who spoke with a Dutch accent who claimed to have been born and bred and raised on the island of Formosa. He claimed he was captured by Jesuits and taken to Europe against his will. He converted to Anglicanism and moved to England, where he became sort of a celebrity, maybe the equivalent of a modern reality television star today. And he wrote this book, which is entirely fictional, about what life was like on Formosa. He even included a map of Formosa, where he'd never been, which really doesn't look anything like Formosa. Formosa, by the way, was understood to be what is now modern-day Taiwan. So the map, most people didn't know how to check, but what made him particularly convincing was he developed his own language, and he would go to dinner parties of aristocrats and hang out with people like Samuel Johnson, and he would talk in gibberish, but he claimed it was the Formosan language, and he would promote the use of the Formosa Alphabet, which he printed in his book. And this is really remarkable. So I know today, here, we'll be careful with this page because it folds out. I know today it's common to have your own alphabet, but here was his completely fictional Formosa alphabet, which he used. And he also embellished his story with all sorts of interesting engravings of people he'd never met, and ideas of what the costumes should look like, et cetera, et cetera. And he even put in a lot of blood and gore because the Formosan people apparently sacrificed all of their young children to the devil. And there's a picture of the devil in this book, The History of Formosa. Now you say, how could anybody believe this? Well, nobody had been to Formosa before, and although he had this Dutch accent and it didn't make a lot of sense, they bought it. They bought it in England. They even brought him before the Royal Academy, and Isaac Newton and all these great scientists quizzed them, and he had an answer for everything. They said, well, wait a minute, if you're from Formosa, why do you have, white, pale skin and blue eyes? And he said, well, that's because aristocrats in Formosa, we live underground, and we're sheltered from the sun. And I guess they understood it. Now we know today that it is all a false account, because the second boat, written by George Salmanazar, was the book at the very end of his life, which he wrote, which was basically called The Confessions of a Complete and Abject Liar. And he details how he pulled this great hoax. So this was a wonderful early 18th century hoax book. And I will just say on one further note, if you're interested in learning about what life was like in Europe at that time in the early 18th century for somebody who was actually from China, I recommend Jonathan Spence's amazing book, The Question of Who. It's one of my favorite history books. Things do not work out well for Who, but he is actually brought to France by Jesuits, and that story is a great story to read. Whereas Salmanazar's lives on as being a complete and utter work of fiction that was widely believed in the 18th century. All right, we're going to finish today with a funny book. I think it's got a great title. It's a funny book, and it is How to Lie with Maps. Now, I particularly like this book because there's an entire chapter on how to pull one over on your local zoning hearing board. And it gives point by point by point on how to use maps to get what you want, but to not be entirely truthful. And I have to say, having been involved in local government and having sat through many of these meetings, I've seen people make these same maps, and I didn't realize they came from a book called How to Lie with Maps. But I'll give you two examples. One, if you're ever trying to get a development done, Amanda, and you're doing a map, what you should do is add trees, okay? And the more trees you add, the more successful the development will be. Don't do a map with no trees. Don't do a map with just a few trees. Do a map with many trees. And it may be entirely fictional, but it'll make your project look much more tolerable. Another example seems to be right out of Harrisburg. Let's say you're an environmentalist and you want to object to the development of, I don't know, something like an incinerator in the heart of your town. You can create a map, and you can have the map be to scale, but make sure you use sort of darker, sinister circles for the area closer to the project you're against, and have them, as they go out, become lighter and less sinister. That will be better. Anyhow, this entire book, How to Lie with Maps, contains point after point after point over how to pull the wool over someone's eyes. Very much like George did with his fictional map of Formosa. Well, that's it for another edition of By Day Friday. We will see you next week and every week, Fridays at noon, for Adventures in the Book Trade. Until next week, I'm Eric Papenfu saying thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.